Here's a question that'll stick with you. What would you do if you had to choose between your own safety and someone else's life? Caleb Rowe didn't have to answer that question, but his dog did. On a freezing morning in rural Montana, fire ripped through Caleb's barn faster than anyone could react. By the time he got to the door, Sawyer, his golden retriever, was already inside. And he wasn't alone. Maple, the mare, stood across from him in the smoke, neither one running for the exit. They were guarding something, protecting it. And when Caleb saw what it was, he realized he was watching a decision he didn't think animals could make. This is the story of what happened when instinct gave way to something bigger. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love seeing how far our stories reach. Caleb had owned that farm for 11 years, and Sawyer had been by his side for nearly all of them. The golden retriever had been a constant presence through every season, every hardship, every quiet morning that started the same way. This morning should have been no different. The sun hadn't fully broken over the Montana hills yet. The sky held that pale gray color that comes just before dawn, when the world feels suspended between night and day. Caleb stood on his porch with a mug of coffee, steam rising into the cold air. The thermometer on the barn read 23 degrees. His breath came out in visible puffs. Everything was still. The kind of still that made you believe nothing could go wrong. Sawyer sat beside him, calm as always. The dog's tail swept slowly across the wooden planks. His eyes half closed in that relaxed way dogs have when they're content. Across the yard, Maple stood in her stall, head lowered, probably still half asleep. The chickens hadn't even started their morning noise yet. It was the kind of peace Caleb had learned to appreciate after years of unpredictable farm life. He took another sip of coffee, checked his watch. 5:47. In 13 minutes he'd start feeding. The routine never changed. Feed the horses first, then the chickens, then check the fence line near the eastern pasture where the posts had been loose last week. Simple. Predictable. Safe. That's when he heard it. A dull thud, then another, coming from the barn. Caleb lowered his mug, listening. The sound came again, rhythmic, deliberate, like something heavy being dropped against wood. He frowned. The animals were fed last night. There shouldn't be any movement in there yet. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in through the loose board he'd been meaning to fix. Then Sawyer barked. Not his usual bark. Not the friendly greeting he gave when Caleb came home, or the playful noise he made when he wanted to go for a walk. This was sharp, urgent, the kind of sound that raised the hair on the back of Caleb's neck. The dog was on his feet now, staring toward the barn, body rigid. "What is it, boy?" Caleb set his mug down on the porch railing. Sawyer barked again, took 3 steps forward, then looked back at Caleb as if to say, "Are you coming or not?" Caleb moved down the porch steps. The morning air bit at his face. His boots crunched on the frosted gravel. As he got closer to the barn, he noticed something odd. The exterior light above the main door was flickering. On, off, on, off. He'd replaced that bulb 2 weeks ago, and the security alarm panel mounted near the entrance showed a blank screen. No red light, no green light, nothing. "That's not right," he muttered. The thudding sound came again, louder now that he was closer. But there was something else underneath it. A low, continuous noise he couldn't quite identify. Not wind, not animals shifting in their stalls. Something else. Sawyer barked a third time and bolted toward the barn entrance. The dog disappeared through the partially open door before Caleb could stop him. "Sawyer, wait!" Caleb broke into a jog. His heartbeat picked up. Something was wrong. He could feel it now, that instinct that comes from years of reading a place. Knowing when things are off, even if you can't explain why. He reached the barn door and pulled it wider. The smell hit him first. Smoke. Not thick yet, but unmistakable. Sharp and acrid, already starting to sting his eyes. Then he saw the interior. The overhead lights were dead. The only illumination came from the gray dawn filtering through the gaps in the walls, and something else. Something orange, flickering, growing. Fire. It had started near the back corner, already climbing the support beams on the east side. Flames moved along the dry wood like water flowing uphill, reaching toward the rafters. Smoke collected near the ceiling, a gray layer that was spreading fast. But that's not what made Caleb's breath catch in his throat. It was Sawyer and Maple. The dog was crouched low in the center aisle, about 15 feet from the entrance. His front legs were spread wide, his head lowered, eyes locked on something Caleb couldn't see through the smoke. He wasn't barking anymore. He was focused, completely still except for the rise and fall of his chest. Across from him, on the opposite side of the aisle, stood Maple. The mare should have been panicking. Horses panic in fires. It's what they do. They kick, they bolt, they run. But Maple wasn't doing any of those things. She stood perfectly still, her body angled toward the same point Sawyer was watching. Her ears were forward, her nostrils flared. But she didn't move. Between them, blocking the center of the aisle, lay a massive support beam. It had collapsed from above, one end wedged against a stall door, the other resting against a hay bale. Flames licked along its surface, small but growing. "Sawyer! Maple! Get out of there!" Caleb shouted. Neither one responded. Neither one even looked at him. Caleb took a step inside. The heat pressed against his face immediately, hotter than it should be for a fire that size. The smoke was thicker at ground level than he'd realized. He could barely see past the beam now. He shouted their names again. Nothing. They just stood there, frozen in place, staring at whatever was on the other side of that burning beam. Caleb's mind raced. Why weren't they running? Animals flee from fire. It's instinct. It's survival. But Sawyer and Maple weren't fleeing. They were standing guard. Standing guard over what? Then, through the smoke, Caleb saw movement. Small, low to the ground, behind the beam. His stomach dropped. No. He moved closer, squinting through the haze, trying to see what they were protecting. The smoke shifted for just a moment, and he caught a glimpse, a shape. 4 legs. Too small to be Maple. Too young to be alone. Willow. The filly was trapped behind the beam, separated from the exit, surrounded by smoke and fire that was spreading faster every second. And Sawyer and Maple weren't running because they weren't leaving her behind. The beam crackled. Flames spread. The rafters above groaned under the heat. And suddenly Caleb realized he was watching something impossible. Something that didn't fit any explanation he'd ever learned about how animals think or act or survive. They were making a choice. Why would they stay? What could possibly make them risk everything for another animal? And how did they both know to do it at the exact same time? Caleb took another step forward, but the heat drove him back. His hands trembled. His throat was dry. The fire was spreading. The barn was failing. Time was running out. But Sawyer and Maple didn't move. They just kept watching, kept waiting, kept protecting. Caleb's legs felt frozen to the ground. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He could only stand there, watching Sawyer and Maple hold their positions like soldiers who'd been given orders they refused to abandon. Willow's small frame trembled behind the beam. The filly was barely 6 months old, all legs and nerves, her dark eyes wide with terror. She had been weaned from her mother only 3 weeks ago. She didn't understand fire. She didn't understand danger. All she knew was that something was very wrong, and she couldn't get out. Okay. Caleb forced himself to think. The beam was too heavy to lift alone, but maybe he could shift it enough to create a gap. He moved forward again, arms outstretched, ready to grab the end closest to him. The heat slammed into him like a physical wall. His eyes watered instantly. His lungs tightened. He got within 5 feet of the beam before the heat became too intense to bear. He tried to push through it, took one more step. The air itself felt like it was burning. He had to fall back, gasping, his face stinging. No, come on! He looked around frantically for something, anything, a tool, a lever, water. But the smoke was thickening faster than he'd anticipated, and every second he spent searching was a second the fire gained ground. That's when Sawyer moved, not away from the danger, toward it. The dog took 2 deliberate steps closer to the burning beam, then stopped. He turned his head and barked once, not at Caleb, at Maple. The mare's ears flicked forward. She shifted her weight, her muscles tensing beneath her coat. Sawyer barked again, same direction, same tone, and then he did something that made Caleb's breath catch. The dog positioned himself at an angle to the beam, lowered his front end, and pressed his shoulder against the charred wood. He was trying to move it. "Sawyer, no, you can't." Caleb started forward, but stopped himself, because Maple was moving too. The mare took 3 careful steps through the smoke, navigating around a patch of flames that had spread to a pile of hay. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She moved with purpose, head down, until she reached the opposite end of the beam. Then she turned, positioned her chest against the wood, and pushed. Caleb felt something cold slide down his spine. They were working together. Not by accident, not by coincidence. They were coordinating. Sawyer adjusted his stance, digging his back paws into the dirt floor. His whole body went rigid as he threw his weight against the beam. Maple mirrored him from her side, her powerful chest straining against the obstacle that stood between them and Willow. The beam didn't budge. Flames crept higher along its length. The smoke was so thick now that Caleb could barely see Willow anymore, just her outline, small and shaking, pressed against the far wall. Sawyer repositioned, tried again. His paws slipped in the dirt. Maple pushed harder, a low sound rumbling from deep in her chest. But the beam was too heavy. The angle was wrong. Physics didn't care how brave they were. Caleb felt his throat tighten. This wasn't happening. Animals didn't do this. They didn't strategize. They didn't sacrifice themselves for others outside their own species. Everything he'd ever read, everything he'd ever been told about animal behavior said they should be running. Self-preservation. That was the rule. That was nature. But Sawyer and Maple weren't following nature's rules. They were following something else entirely. The dog looked at Willow, then back at the beam. His tail was tucked low, his body language tense, but not from fear. From focus, from determination. He barked once more at Maple, a short, sharp sound that carried command in it. The mare responded immediately, shifting her position 3 inches to the left. Caleb's chest felt tight. He'd trained Sawyer. He'd worked with him for almost a decade, but he'd never taught him this. No one had taught him this. And Maple, she was a horse. Horses don't take instructions from dogs, except she was. Caleb stared at his dog and his horse as they performed a rescue he didn't think they were capable of conceiving, let alone executing. It was as if everything he thought he knew about them had suddenly vanished, replaced by a stranger's intelligence. The rafters groaned above them. A shower of sparks rained down near the entrance. The fire had found the old hay storage area and was feeding on it hungrily. They had minutes at most before the whole structure became unstable. Sawyer planted himself again. This time he wedged his shoulder beneath the beam at a different angle, trying to lift instead of push. The wood shifted, just barely, maybe an inch. Not enough to free Willow, but enough to prove the physics might work if they could just get the leverage right. Maple saw it too. She adjusted, moving closer to Sawyer's end of the beam, concentrating their combined force on a single point. Caleb wanted to help. Every instinct screamed at him to get in there and add his strength to theirs. But the heat was too intense now. The smoke was too thick. He'd be overcome before he reached them. And somehow, some way, they seemed to know what they were doing better than he did. The central question burned in his mind as hot as the fire consuming his barn. Were they actually thinking through this problem? Could they understand cause and effect, weight distribution, teamwork? Or was this something deeper, something about connection that humans couldn't measure or explain? Willow let out a frightened cry. The sound cut through the smoke and the crackling flames like a knife. She tried to move closer to the beam, to the 2 figures protecting her, but stumbled. Her legs weren't steady. Fear had taken over. Sawyer's head snapped toward the sound. For the first time since Caleb had entered the barn, the dog's focus wavered. He looked at Willow, then at the beam, then back at Willow. His body language shifted. The tension changed. Decision made. He stepped away from the beam and walked straight toward the fire. Not around it, not away from it. Toward it. Toward the gap between the flames and the wall, where the smoke was thickest, where visibility dropped to almost nothing. Toward Willow. "Sawyer, don't!" Caleb lunged forward, but the heat drove him back again. His voice cracked. "Please don't!" But Sawyer kept walking. 1 step, 2 steps, 3, disappearing into the gray wall of smoke, heading directly into the worst of the danger. Maple held her ground, standing guard on her side of the beam, her eyes following Sawyer until he vanished completely. Caleb's hands were shaking. His heart hammered against his ribs. The smoke swallowed everything. For 5 seconds he couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the fire. Then a bark cut through the chaos, muffled but unmistakable, coming from behind the beam, from the other side, from where Willow was trapped. The smoke had become a living thing. It moved through the barn like something with intent, filling every space, pressing down from the ceiling, creeping along the walls. Caleb could taste it now, metallic and bitter on his tongue. His eyes burned. Each breath felt smaller than the last. Above him, the fire had found the rafters. Orange light danced along the wooden beams that held up the roof. The flames moved fast, faster than seemed possible, jumping from one beam to the next like they were following a map. The old wood was dry, Decades of Montana summers had baked every drop of moisture out of it. Now it was paying the price. A crack echoed through the barn, sharp, loud, the sound of something breaking under pressure. Caleb's eyes shot upward. One of the crossbeams had split down the middle. It sagged in the center, held up only by the bolts at either end. How long before those bolts gave out? How long before the whole thing came down? He couldn't see Sawyer anymore. The dog had disappeared into the smoke behind the beam, and the gray wall had closed behind him like a curtain. Caleb strained to hear something, anything, that would tell him Sawyer was still okay, still breathing, still alive. Another bark cut through the noise, distant but clear. It came from behind the beam, from the same spot where Willow was trapped. Sawyer had reached her. Relief flooded Caleb's chest for half a second before reality crushed it. Reaching her didn't matter if they couldn't get out. The fire spread further along the rafters. It had consumed the entire eastern side now and was working its way toward the center. Pieces of burning debris fell from above, landing in the hay scattered across the floor. Each piece started a new, small fire. They were multiplying, growing, connecting. Caleb pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, trying to filter the smoke. It didn't help much. His lungs felt tight. His head was starting to swim. How much longer could he stay in here? How much longer before the choice was made for him? Then movement caught his eye through the smoke. Maple was shifting position. The mare moved carefully, deliberately, stepping over a patch of flames that had spread across the aisle. She repositioned herself at the beam, closer to the center this time, her head lowered. From the other side of the beam, Sawyer's bark came again. Different this time. 3 short bursts, a pattern. Maple responded. She pressed her chest against the beam and pushed. The wood shifted. Barely, maybe half an inch. The end closest to Caleb scraped against the dirt floor, dragging a thin line through the dust. Hope flared in Caleb's chest. If they could just move it a little more, just enough to create a gap big enough for Willow to squeeze through. But the beam settled back into place, wedged tight between the stall door and the hay bale. Maple backed up, breathing hard, her coat dark with sweat despite the cold that had filled the barn just minutes ago. The rafters groaned again, longer this time. A sustained sound that made Caleb's skin prickle. He looked up and saw the broken crossbeam sag another 2 inches. Embers rained down from it like snow. Time wasn't just running out, it was collapsing. Sawyer barked again from behind the beam, the same 3-burst pattern. Maple's ears flicked forward. She repositioned, this time angling herself differently, her shoulder against the beam instead of her chest. She pushed. The beam moved. 3 inches this time. Caleb saw it clearly, saw the gap widen just slightly at the point where it rested against the stall door. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on." But the beam wouldn't budge any further. Maple strained against it, her hooves digging furrows in the dirt, her entire body trembling with effort. The wood groaned, but held firm. She backed off, sides heaving. Caleb's mind raced. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand here watching them fail. But every time he tried to move closer, the heat drove him back. The smoke was thicker at ground level now, rolling in waves across the floor. He could barely see Maple anymore, just her dark shape moving through the gray. Seconds stretched. Each one felt like an hour. Caleb became aware of every sound, the crackle of flames consuming wood, the hiss of fire spreading through hay, the wheeze of his own breathing, the pounding of his heart in his ears. Everything was too loud and too quiet at the same time. Another crack from above, this one sharper than the others. The crossbeam dropped another inch. The bolts at the western end were pulling free from the rafter they'd been anchored to for 30 years. Caleb could see the metal bending, see the wood around it splintering. When that beam fell, it would take half the roof with it. Maple tried again. She positioned herself at yet another angle, this time with her front legs spread wide, using her weight differently. Sawyer's bark came once more from the smoke, urgent now, carrying something that sounded almost like encouragement. The mare pushed. Her muscles stood out beneath her coat, her neck strained. The beam scraped forward. 4 inches. 5. Caleb's breath caught. The gap was widening. Not enough yet, but closer. So much closer. Then the beam caught on something, a nail, a piece of metal, something underneath that Caleb couldn't see. It stopped moving. Maple backed up, breathing in harsh gasps. She tried to reposition, but her legs were shaking now. Exhaustion was setting in. The heat was getting to her. She'd pushed herself past the point most animals would have quit. The fire climbed higher on the walls. The smoke dropped lower from the ceiling. The space between them was shrinking. The breathable air was disappearing. Caleb's vision started to blur at the edges. His knees felt weak. He had a choice to make. Stay and watch them fail, trying to save Willow, or leave now while he still could. Save himself. Call for help. Hope they'd arrive in time. But would they? The nearest fire station was 15 minutes away. The barn would be gone in 5. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. His throat was raw, his chest burned. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, to get out, to breathe clean air. He didn't move. He couldn't leave them. Not Sawyer, not Maple, not Willow. If they were willing to stay, to keep trying against impossible odds, then what kind of person would he be if he ran? The crossbeam groaned one more time. The sound was different now. Final. The bolts were giving way. Sawyer's bark cut through the smoke again, insistent, desperate, and Maple, despite her exhaustion, despite the heat, despite every reason to give up, positioned herself one more time. She planted her hooves, lowered her head, and pushed with everything she had left. The beam moved. 6 inches, 7. The gap widened. Almost enough. Almost, but not quite. The beam settled again, caught on that same obstacle underneath. And this time, when Maple backed away, her legs nearly buckled. She'd given everything. There was nothing left. The fire roared louder. The crossbeam above dropped another inch. The barn was failing. Time had run out. And the gap still wasn't wide enough. How could they possibly move it now? What could they do that they hadn't already tried? And how many seconds did they have left before the decision was made for all of them? Before we continue, you and most people watching right now might never see another video from this channel, all because you forgot to subscribe. So please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. It is literally the only way you tell me that the hours researching, writing, and editing these stories was worth it. Now, let's get back to the story. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Maple stood with her head lowered, sides heaving, every muscle in her body trembling from exhaustion. The fire continued its relentless march across the rafters. The smoke pressed down heavier. The crossbeam above groaned its final warning. Then Sawyer appeared through the smoke. He emerged from behind the beam like a ghost materializing from gray fog, his golden coat darkened with soot and ash. He moved with purpose despite the heat, despite the danger, despite everything that should have driven him away. He walked straight to the beam and studied it for a moment, his head tilting slightly as if calculating something only he could understand. Then he dropped to his belly, not beside the beam, underneath it. Caleb's heart stopped. "No, Sawyer, no." But the dog was already moving, crawling forward on his stomach, wedging himself into the narrow gap between the bottom of the beam and the dirt floor. The space was barely wide enough. The flames on the beam's surface were close enough to singe his fur. The heat radiating from the wood had to be unbearable. Sawyer didn't stop. He pushed himself further under, his back pressing against the underside of the beam, his legs spreading wide for leverage. Then, impossibly, he began to push upward. His entire body went rigid, his legs strained, his back arched. He was trying to lift the beam using nothing but his own body as a lever. Caleb couldn't breathe. This was an impossible risk to take. The beam weighed hundreds of pounds. Even if Sawyer could lift it an inch, which was impossible, the effort would break him, or the flames would reach him first. But Maple understood. The mare moved before Caleb's mind could catch up to what was happening. She positioned herself at the opposite end of the beam, the same spot where she'd pushed before, but this time she didn't use her chest. She turned sideways, pressed her shoulder against the wood, and angled her body to push upward and forward at the same time. Sawyer pushed from below. Maple pushed from the side. 2 different angles, 2 different forces, working in perfect coordination. The beam shifted, not sideways this time, up. The end near Sawyer rose 3 inches off the ground. The end near Maple tilted, the angle changing, and suddenly the obstacle underneath that had been catching it before lost its grip. The beam scraped forward, 8 inches, 10, 12. The gap widened. Caleb's throat tightened. His eyes burned from more than just smoke. It was working. Against every law of physics he understood, against every reasonable expectation, it was actually working. Sawyer crawled out from underneath, his movements slower now, more labored. He shook himself once, a quick, instinctive motion, then turned and disappeared back into the smoke behind the beam. The silence that followed felt infinite. Caleb strained to hear something, anything, a bark, a movement, a sign that Sawyer was still okay. But there was nothing except the roar of the fire and the groan of failing wood above. "Sawyer?" His voice came out as barely a whisper, swallowed by the smoke. The crossbeam above gave its final warning, a sharp crack that echoed through the barn like a gunshot. The bolts pulled free. The beam dropped 6 inches, held now by only one remaining anchor point. Then, through the smoke, a single bark. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was calm, controlled. A signal. Movement appeared in the gray haze behind the beam, small, low to the ground. Willow. The filly emerged through the widened gap, moving carefully, her legs unsteady from fear and smoke. But she wasn't alone. Sawyer walked beside her, so close their bodies nearly touched, guiding each step. When she stumbled, he pressed against her side, steadying her. When she hesitated, he moved forward first, showing her the way. Maple watched from her position, her eyes tracking every movement. As soon as Willow cleared the beam, the mare moved to the filly's other side, creating a protective barrier between her and the flames that lined the walls. They moved as a unit, Sawyer in front setting the pace, Maple beside, shielding, Willow in the middle, trusting them completely. Caleb backed toward the entrance, clearing a path, his legs weak with relief and disbelief. They were going to make it. Against everything, they were going to make it out. The three animals were halfway to the door when the crossbeam finally gave way. It fell in slow motion, or maybe time just distorted in that moment. The beam crashed down, taking a section of roof with it. Burning wood and rafters collapsed into the space they'd just left behind, landing exactly where Willow had been trapped seconds earlier. The impact sent up a wave of sparks and smoke. The fire roared louder, fed by the fresh air rushing in through the new hole in the roof. Flames shot upward, reaching toward the sky. But Sawyer, Maple, and Willow were already through the door. They burst out of the barn into the cold Montana morning. And Caleb followed, stumbling into the fresh air behind them. His lungs seized, coughing violently as clean oxygen flooded his system. His eyes streamed. His legs gave out and he dropped to his knees in the frosted grass. The animals kept moving, putting distance between themselves and the burning structure. They didn't stop until they reached the pasture fence 50 yards away. Only then did they halt, turning to look back at what they'd escaped. Caleb looked up from the ground, his vision blurred, his chest heaving. Through the tears and the smoke still clinging to him, he watched them. Sawyer stood on one side of Willow. Maple stood on the other. The filly pressed against both of them, her small body trembling but safe, protected, alive. The barn groaned behind him. More of the roof was collapsing. The structure that had stood for 30 years was being consumed piece by piece. Everything inside would be lost. The equipment, the tools, the memories. But none of that mattered. Caleb's hands shook as he pushed himself to his feet. His dog and his horse had just performed a rescue that shouldn't have been possible. They'd made decisions that animals weren't supposed to make. They'd worked together in ways that defied every assumption about intelligence, about instinct, about the barriers between species. Sawyer turned to look at him then. Their eyes met across the distance. The dog's tail gave a single, weak wag, and in that moment Caleb understood something that would stay with him forever. He'd thought he knew his animals. He'd thought he understood them. He'd been wrong. Behind them, another section of the barn collapsed, sending flames shooting higher into the early morning sky. The sound would have been deafening if Caleb's ears weren't still ringing. Smoke billowed up in thick black columns, visible for miles. Neighbors would see it. Someone would call for help. Fire trucks would come. But by then, the barn would be gone. Right now, in this moment between disaster and rescue, it was just Caleb and 3 animals who'd survived something that should have ended it all. Sawyer's legs buckled. He caught himself, but barely. The toll was showing now. The exhaustion, the smoke inhalation, the heat he must have withstood crawling under that beam. Maple lowered her head toward him, a gentle gesture Caleb had never seen her make before. Willow pressed closer between them, as if she understood that these two had just saved her life. And watching them, Caleb felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain, something else. Something bigger than gratitude or relief or shock. It was awe. What had he just witnessed? What were they capable of that he'd never known? And how would he ever look at them the same way again? The pasture grass was still white with frost. The sun had barely risen above the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of pale orange and pink. Steam rose from the animals' bodies where heat met cold air. They stood together in a tight cluster, 3 survivors catching their breath in the aftermath of something none of them should have survived. Caleb walked toward them slowly, his legs unsteady, his whole body shaking from adrenaline crash. Each step felt heavy. His lungs still burned. The taste of smoke lingered in his mouth, metallic and wrong. Sawyer watched him approach, but didn't move from Willow's side. The dog's golden coat was streaked with black soot. Small patches looked singed, the fur shorter and darker where the heat had gotten too close. His breathing came in quick, shallow pants. But his eyes were alert, focused. Still protective. Maple stood on the filly's other side, her larger body creating a windbreak against the cold morning air. Her coat was dark with sweat and ash, her mane tangled with debris. She shifted her weight slightly when Caleb got close. Not nervous, just aware, keeping track of everyone's position. Willow pressed against both of them, her head tucked low, her small body still trembling. She was the youngest, the most vulnerable, and somehow she seemed to understand that these two had saved her. Every few seconds she'd lean harder against Sawyer or Maple, seeking comfort, seeking safety. Caleb dropped to his knees in the grass a few feet away. He didn't trust his legs anymore. His hands were still shaking. He looked at the three of them, really looked, and felt something shift inside his chest. "You saved her," he said quietly. His voice came out rough, damaged from the smoke. "You both saved her." Sawyer's tail moved. Just once. A small acknowledgement. Then the dog turned his attention back to Willow, lowering his head to sniff her neck, checking her over with the same careful attention a parent would give a child. Maple did the same from her side, her nose running along Willow's back, her ears flicking forward and back, listening for any signs of distress. They were taking care of her. Even now, even after everything they'd been through, their focus was still on making sure she was okay. Caleb watched them, his mind struggling to process what had happened. He'd raised Sawyer from a puppy. He'd worked with Maple for years. He thought he knew them. He thought he understood what they were capable of. But this level of cooperation? This kind of decision-making? This was something else entirely. Animals acted on instinct. That's what everyone said. That's what the books taught. They didn't plan. They didn't sacrifice. They didn't work across species lines to solve complex problems. Except they just had. Behind them, the barn continued to burn. The flames were visible above the tree line, orange and angry against the lightening sky. The sound of it was constant now, a low roar punctuated by crashes as more of the structure gave way. Caleb heard it in the distance first. The sirens. Faint but growing louder. Someone had seen the smoke. Someone had called it in. Within minutes, 2 fire trucks appeared on the long dirt road leading to his property, their lights flashing red and blue against the gray dawn. They pulled up near the barn, and firefighters jumped out, moving with practiced efficiency. Hoses unrolled, water began flowing. Shouts echoed across the property as they worked to contain the fire before it spread to the other buildings. Caleb stood up slowly, his legs still weak. He should go talk to them, explain what happened. But he couldn't make himself leave the animals yet. Not when Sawyer looked like he could collapse at any moment. Not when Maple was still on high alert, watching the commotion near the barn with cautious eyes. One of the firefighters broke away from the group and jogged over to the pasture. He was young, maybe mid-20s, his face already streaked with soot. "Sir, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Caleb shook his head. "I'm okay, just smoke. Nothing serious." The firefighter's eyes moved to the animals. Were they inside? Yeah. Caleb's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. All three of them. They got out on their own? Caleb looked at Sawyer and Maple. At the way they stood together, still protecting Willow. At the evidence of what they'd endured written across their bodies in soot and singed fur. Yeah, he said quietly. They did. The firefighter nodded, his expression shifting to something like respect. That's remarkable. Animals usually panic in fires. You're lucky. Lucky? The word felt insufficient. Luck was random. Luck was chance. What happened in that barn wasn't luck. It was choice. It was courage. It was something Caleb didn't have words for yet. More firefighters arrived at the scene. An ambulance pulled up, and a paramedic approached to check Caleb over, despite his protests. She listened to his lungs, checked his oxygen levels, looked at his eyes. Minor smoke inhalation, she said. He'd be fine. Just take it easy for a few days. The barn fire was under control within 30 minutes. The structure was a total loss, but they'd saved the other buildings. The house was safe. The equipment shed was untouched. It could have been so much worse. Caleb's neighbor, Ruth, showed up with her teenage son. She'd seen the smoke from her property 2 miles away. She brought blankets, water, and a thermos of coffee that tasted like the best thing Caleb had ever consumed. "Oh my God, Caleb," she said, her hand on his shoulder. "What happened?" he explained, the words coming out in fragments. "Electrical fault, probably. Old wiring. The alarm system failed. By the time he realized what was happening, the fire had already spread." Ruth listened, her eyes moving to the animals in the pasture. "They were all inside?" "Yes." "And they got out?" Caleb nodded. Ruth's son, Danny, had pulled out his phone. He was 17, always had his phone out, always documenting everything. He walked toward the pasture fence, his camera pointed at the 3 animals still clustered together. "Danny, leave them alone," Ruth called. But Danny had already taken the photo. He lowered his phone and looked at the screen. "Mom, look at this." Ruth walked over. Caleb followed, curious despite his exhaustion. The image on Danny's phone stopped him cold. Sawyer sat in the foreground, his soot-covered body turned slightly toward the camera. Maple stood behind him, her head lowered toward Willow, who pressed between them. The rising sun backlit them, creating a glow around their silhouettes. Behind them, barely visible through the trees, smoke still rose from the remains of the barn. But it was their positioning that caught Caleb's attention. The way Sawyer and Maple framed Willow. The protective stance. The physical closeness. The image captured something essential about what had happened. Something words couldn't quite express. "That's incredible," Ruth whispered. Danny looked up at his mom. "Can I post this?" Ruth glanced at Caleb. "Is that okay?" Caleb studied the photo again. There was something powerful about it. Something that told the story without explanation. The soot-covered animals. The smoke in the background. The sunrise. The obvious bond between 3 creatures who shouldn't have survived. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's okay." Danny's thumbs moved across his phone screen, adding a simple caption. "These 3 just survived a barn fire together. Montana strong." He hit share. The photo uploaded to his social media account, one image among thousands posted that morning across the state. Danny slipped his phone back in his pocket and went to help his mom bring more supplies from their truck. None of them thought about it again. None of them realized what was about to happen. Because within the hour, that photo would be shared by someone else. Then someone else. Then dozens of people. Then hundreds. And by the end of the day, it would be traveling across the country, viewed by millions, sparking a conversation that went far beyond one Montana farm. But in that moment, Caleb just stood by the pasture fence, watching his dog and his horse continue to care for the young filly they'd risked everything to save, and wondered how he'd ever explain what he'd witnessed to anyone who wasn't there. How do you tell people that animals are capable of something we thought only humans could do? How do you describe coordination that shouldn't exist? How do you put into words the moment you realized everything you thought you knew was wrong? And what would happen when the rest of the world saw that photo and started asking the same questions? Before we continue, I would like to let you know that you don't owe me a subscription. But if this video made you feel anything at all, disappearing without supporting it says a lot. So please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. It is literally the only way you tell me that the hours researching, writing, and editing these stories was worth it. Now, let's get back to the story. By noon, Caleb's phone wouldn't stop ringing. He'd spent the morning with a veterinarian who'd driven out from town to check on the animals. Sawyer had minor burns on his back and paws, nothing serious but enough to need treatment. Maple had inhaled more smoke than was safe, but her lungs were clear. Willow was shaken but physically unharmed. They'd all recover. The vet had looked at Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I've been doing this for 23 years, she'd said quietly. "I've never seen anything like what you described." Caleb hadn't known what to say to that. Now he stood in his kitchen, his phone buzzing for the 15th time in an hour. He didn't recognize most of the numbers. News stations from Billings, Helena, even Bozeman, a reporter from the Great Falls Tribune, someone from an animal behavior research center in Colorado. He let them go to voicemail. Through the window, he could see Sawyer resting in the shade near the porch, bandages wrapped around his paws. Maple and Willow were in the near pasture, grazing side by side like nothing extraordinary had happened. But every few minutes, Maple would lift her head and check on the filly, making sure she was still close. Ruth called. Caleb answered that one. "Have you seen it?" she asked, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Seen what?" "The photo. Danny's photo. Caleb, it's everywhere." He pulled the phone away from his ear and opened his social media app, something he rarely used. The notifications were already overwhelming. Hundreds of them. He clicked on Danny's original post. The share count had stopped making sense. 12,000 shares. Then, as he watched, it jumped to 13,000. Comments flooded in faster than he could read them. "This is what courage looks like. Animals understand more than we give them credit for. That dog and horse are heroes. I'm crying. This is the most beautiful thing I've seen all year." Caleb scrolled through the comments, his chest tightening. People were tagging friends, sharing it to their own pages, adding their own stories about animals who'd done remarkable things. The conversation was spreading like wildfire, faster than the actual fire had moved through his barn. "Caleb, you still there?" Ruth's voice brought him back. "Yeah, I'm here. The news wants to interview you. Channel 5 called me looking for your number. I didn't give it to them. But I figured you should know." "I don't want to do interviews." "I understand, but Caleb, people are really connecting with this. It's not just about the fire. It's about what Sawyer and Maple did. People are asking questions." He knew what questions she meant. He'd been asking them himself all morning. Were they just acting on instinct, or did they actually understand what they were doing? Could animals really think through problems like that? Could they actually care about other species the way humans did? By evening, the photo had jumped beyond Montana. National news outlets picked it up. Animal advocacy groups shared it. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed by over 2 million people. The comment section became a debate forum. This is proof that animals have emotional intelligence we don't understand yet. It's trained behavior. The dog was probably taught to protect livestock. No training explains a horse staying in a burning barn. They were protecting their herd. That's instinct, not intelligence. Instinct doesn't explain coordination. They worked together. Back and forth. Hundreds of voices weighing in. Behaviorists, trainers, pet owners, people who'd never set foot on a farm, but had strong opinions anyway. A reporter finally tracked down Caleb's number. She was polite, professional, asked if he'd be willing to share his side of the story. He declined. She asked if he'd at least confirm some basic facts. He gave her the minimum. Yes, there was a fire. Yes, all 3 animals survived. No, he didn't train them to do what they did. So you're saying this was spontaneous? The reporter pressed. Caleb looked out the window at Sawyer, who was watching him from the porch. I'm saying I didn't teach them that. Nobody did. The article published the next day under the headline, Montana Dog and Horse Perform Impossible Rescue in Barn Fire. Within hours, the community response began. Caleb's property became a steady stream of vehicles. Neighbors he'd barely spoken to in years showed up with supplies, lumber, tools, offers to help rebuild. Ruth organized a schedule so people wouldn't all arrive at once. By the end of the first week, the foundation for a new barn was already laid. We take care of our own out here, his neighbor Tom said, hammering nails into a frame beam. And after what those animals did? This is the least we can do. A local animal safety organization reached out. They wanted to use Sawyer and Maple's story as the foundation for a new initiative focused on barn fire prevention and emergency planning for livestock. They'd create educational materials, host workshops, install smoke detectors in barns across 3 counties for free. We've been trying to get funding for this for years, the director told Caleb over the phone. But people don't pay attention until something dramatic happens. Your story gave us the platform we needed. Caleb didn't know how to feel about that. He hadn't wanted a platform. He hadn't wanted attention. He just wanted his animals safe and his barn rebuilt. But the story had taken on a life beyond his control. A university research team studying animal cognition contacted him. They wanted to observe Sawyer and Maple, run some tests, document their behavior. Caleb said no. These weren't research subjects. They were family. Yet the questions kept coming, from scientists, from journalists, from ordinary people who'd seen the photo and wanted to understand what it meant. The debate intensified online. Animal behavior experts weighed in with competing theories. Some insisted it was elaborate instinct. Others argued it demonstrated higher-level reasoning. A few suggested it was evidence of emotional bonds that crossed species barriers in ways science hadn't fully documented yet. One comment thread grew to over 3,000 replies. This changes how we should think about animal intelligence. One incident doesn't prove anything. It's not one incident. People are sharing similar stories in the comments. This happens more than we realize. Anecdotes aren't data. Data starts with observation. This is something worth studying. Caleb read these exchanges late at night, his coffee gone cold, Sawyer asleep at his feet. The dog had recovered well. The burns were healing. But something had changed in the way he carried himself. A quiet confidence. An awareness that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and Caleb had just never noticed. 3 weeks after the fire, a documentary filmmaker reached out. She wanted to tell the full story, interview Caleb, capture footage of Sawyer and Maple and Willow together. She promised it would be respectful, thoughtful, focused on the larger questions about animal consciousness and connection. Caleb said he'd think about it. That night he sat on his porch watching the sun set. The new barn was taking shape behind him, the frame already up, the roof going on next week. It would be better than the old one. Safer. Fire-resistant materials. Multiple exits. State-of-the-art alarm system. Sawyer sat beside him, just like he had on the morning of the fire. Maple grazed in the pasture with Willow, the two of them inseparable now. The filly had grown in the past few weeks, stronger and more confident, but she still stayed close to the mare who'd saved her life. "What do you think, boy?" Caleb asked quietly. "Should I let them tell your story?" Sawyer's tail thumped against the porch boards. Once. Twice. Not an answer, exactly. But enough. Because maybe this wasn't just about one farm or 3 animals, or a single morning when everything went wrong and somehow went right. Maybe it was about something larger. About what we miss when we don't pay attention. About what animals are capable of when we stop assuming we know everything about them. Maybe the world needed to hear this story because it challenged us to reconsider what we thought we knew. But there was something else, too. Something Caleb had noticed over the past few weeks that nobody else had seen yet. Something about the way Sawyer and Maple interacted now. The way they communicated without sound. The way they moved in sync. What they'd done in that barn hadn't been a one-time occurrence. It was who they were, who they'd maybe always been. And if that was true, what else were they capable of? What other moments had Caleb missed because he wasn't looking closely enough? The documentary filmmaker wanted answers. The scientists wanted data. The public wanted meaning. But Caleb was starting to realize the real story wasn't about the fire at all. It was about what comes after you stop thinking you understand something and start paying attention instead. And that story was just beginning. Are you starting to see animals differently after hearing this? Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. What do you think? Instinct or intelligence? 6 months later, the new barn stood complete. It looked different from the old one. Modern materials replaced weathered wood. Steel beams reinforced the structure. Smoke detectors lined the ceiling at precise intervals, their small red lights blinking in the darkness like watchful eyes. Multiple exits had been built into the design, wide doors that could be opened from inside or out. Every safety recommendation the fire marshal had suggested was incorporated. But for all its improvements, it was still just a barn, 4 walls and a roof, a place for animals to shelter from Montana winters and summer storms. The real changes were harder to see. Caleb stood in the doorway on a cool October morning, coffee in hand, watching Sawyer move through the barn with Willow following close behind. The filly was nearly a year old now. Almost fully grown, her legs long and strong. The frightened baby who'd been trapped behind a burning beam had transformed into a confident young horse. But she still looked to Sawyer for guidance. The dog walked the perimeter of the barn each morning, the same route every time. Not frantically, not anxiously, just a calm, methodical check of the space. Willow walked beside him, matching his pace, learning the pattern. When Sawyer paused to sniff at a corner where hay was stored, Willow paused too. When he moved to the far stall to check on the new chickens Caleb had brought in last month, she followed. Maple watched from her stall, her dark eyes tracking their movement. The mare's coat had returned to its healthy shine, the evidence of that morning erased from her appearance. But she'd changed too, in ways that had nothing to do with physical recovery. She'd become more deliberate, more aware. She'd always been calm, but now there was something else in her demeanor, a kind of quiet authority. When the other horses Caleb had acquired got nervous during thunderstorms, Maple remained steady, and they'd move closer to her, taking comfort in her presence. Leadership without force, protection without drama. Sawyer finished his morning check and returned to where Caleb stood. The dog's paws had healed completely, leaving no visible scars. His coat had grown back where the fire had singed it. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked like any other well-cared-for golden retriever approaching middle age. But Caleb knew better now. "Good boy," he said quietly, reaching down to scratch behind Sawyer's ears. The dog's tail wagged once. Then he turned his attention back to Willow, who was exploring a new bale of hay someone had delivered yesterday. The documentary had aired 3 months ago. Caleb had agreed to participate, though he'd limited the filming to just 2 days and refused to let them turn it into something sensational. The filmmaker had kept her promise. The finished piece was thoughtful, focusing more on questions than answers. The response had been overwhelming. Letters arrived from across the country. Emails from people sharing their own stories of animals who'd done remarkable things. A family in Oregon whose cat had alerted them to a gas leak. A man in Florida whose parrot had called 911 during a medical emergency. A woman in Vermont whose goat had protected her chickens from a predator. Story after story, pouring in from people who'd witnessed something that didn't fit the neat categories they'd been taught. A research foundation had used the documentary as a springboard to secure funding for a long-term study on interspecies cooperation. They weren't studying Sawyer and Maple directly. Caleb had made sure of that. But they were documenting similar behaviors in other animals, trying to understand the mechanisms behind it. The debate continued online, though it had evolved. Fewer people argued about whether animals were capable of higher reasoning. More people were asking how we could better recognize and respect those capabilities. The Barn Fire Prevention Initiative had expanded beyond 3 counties. 15 counties now. Free smoke detectors installed in over 400 barns. Educational workshops attended by thousands of farmers and ranchers. 3 potential tragedies prevented because someone had learned to recognize the warning signs. Lives saved because of what happened on one Montana farm on one cold morning. But here, where it all began, life had returned to something close to normal. The news crews were gone. The reporters had moved on to other stories. The social media shares had slowed to a trickle. What remained was quieter, more permanent. Caleb watched Sawyer guide Willow back toward Maple's stall. The mare lowered her head as they approached, greeting the filly with a soft sound. Willow pressed her nose against Maple's neck, and the 3 of them stood together for a moment, a casual intimacy that had become routine. No cameras captured it. No one would write articles about this particular moment. But it was real in a way the viral photo could never be. This was who they were when the world wasn't watching. Patient, connected, aware of each other in ways Caleb was still learning to recognize. He'd started paying closer attention, to the small signals they gave each other, to the patterns in how they moved together, to the moments when they made decisions that seemed simple on the surface but revealed deeper understanding underneath. Last week, a new horse had arrived, a rescue Caleb had agreed to take in temporarily. The animal was nervous, traumatized by whatever had happened before. Sawyer had approached carefully, giving space but staying present. Maple had positioned herself nearby, not close enough to crowd, but close enough to be noticed. Within 2 days, the rescue horse had calmed, started eating normally, began interacting with the others. No one had trained Sawyer and Maple to do that. They'd just known what was needed. Courage, Caleb had learned, wasn't always loud. It didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was just the quiet choice to stay when leaving would be easier, to act when freezing would be safer, to care when indifference would be simpler. The fire had revealed that courage, but it had been there all along, woven into their daily interactions, visible only to those willing to look closely enough to see it. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the frost on the grass. Caleb finished his coffee and set the mug on a fence post. He had work to do, fences to check, feed to distribute, the routine tasks that made up farm life. But first, he walked into the barn where Sawyer stood with Maple and Willow. The dog looked up at him, tail wagging slowly, eyes bright with that intelligence Caleb had finally learned to recognize. "You ready for another day?" Caleb asked. Sawyer's tail wagged faster. Together, they began the morning routine, not because of some viral photo or documentary or initiative, not because the world was watching or because anyone would write about it, just because this was who they were. A man and his animals taking care of each other day after day in the quiet spaces where real courage lives. Maple followed them out into the pasture, Willow close at her side. The young horse was still learning, still growing, still figuring out her place in this small world. But she had good teachers, and she was learning that protection isn't about size or strength. It's about showing up, staying present, choosing someone else's safety over your own comfort. Sawyer walked ahead, his golden coat bright in the morning sun, leading the way like he always had, like he always would. Not a hero, just a dog doing what dogs do when we give them credit for being more than we assumed they could be. The barn stood behind them, rebuilt and ready, a monument to survival, to choices, made in impossible moments, to bonds that crossed the lines we'd drawn between species. But the real story wasn't in the structure. It was in the way Sawyer turned to check on Willow, in the way Maple watched over both of them, in the way 3 animals who'd survived the impossible continued to choose each other day after day, in the quiet moments that no camera would ever capture. That's where courage lives, not in the fire, in everything that comes after. And that story doesn't end. It just continues, quietly, persistently, in every small choice to stay instead of run, to protect instead of flee, to care instead of ignore. The question isn't whether animals are capable of courage. They proved that already. The question is whether we're paying enough attention to see it. If this story moved you, don't just scroll past. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're working hard to bring you more stories that matter, stories that change how you see the world. These stories take time, research, and heart to create. Your like, your share, your comment, they tell us you want more of this. They tell us these stories matter to you the way they matter to us. So please take 2 seconds, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell us, what's the most courageous thing you've ever seen an animal do? We read every single comment. And if you've made it this far, you're part of something bigger than just a video. You're part of a community that believes in recognizing courage wherever we find it. Don't let this story end with you. Pass it on.